Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Michael, for that excessively long introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here again at the Japan Society. This is a kind of complicated topic, and please bear with me. I'm very, very happy after I give the talk to answer questions. So I'm going to read it because it is complicated. From the distance of hindsight, it is easy to see that one of the great artistic contributions Japan has made in recent history has been its stunning tradition of post-war photography. As is now openly acknowledged, in the 1960s and 70s, Japanese photographers were inventing a new visual language, highly original. They were also aware of new photography outside the country, which they absorbed and modified in absolutely distinctive ways. Japanese photography of this era spoke to the political and social realities of the country and also to its artistic traditions. Though vital and original, the photographers were not fully acknowledged as artists in Japan until they were recognized as such from abroad. There has been a tradition of serious photography in Japan since the 19th century, including photography made as an expression of modern art in the pre-war period. After the war, and probably promoted by the conscious transformation of the war economy, amateur photography, which employed optics, chemistry, and sophisticated mechanics, became a major industry. Unlike the United States, in Japan there were no public exhibitions for photography in museums, and there were no galleries. It must be said that even in the United States at that time, there was only the most modest of such traditions. In Japan, this new surge in photography was supported through publishing. The great magazines that sponsored the work of the important photographers, Shomei Tohmatsu, Daido Moriyama, and others, whose work appeared in Asahi Camera, Camera Mainichi, and similar publications, were monthly or bi-weekly supplements to the substantial production of daily newspapers that still exist all over Japan. They were directed at the lively amateur market. This photography culture supported an emergent group of innovative photographers. How did the Americans know about it? Was this awareness made through personal contacts? Some American photographers were certainly visiting Japan at this time. Eugene Smith, for instance, covered the Korean War for life, and he also photographed Japanese industry. William Klein visited Tokyo in 1961, but his real influence was made through his book on New York, published in 1956. And in any case, the photographers who met him, and Moriyama was one, found him arrogant and self-centered, so they didn't want to socialize with him. There were Americans who came to Japan after the war or who stayed on after the armistice and supported themselves as translators. One would be Donald Ritchie, who became an expert in the innovative film of the period. But photography was not among his interests, and he was kind of blind to it, in fact. There was an important migration of Japanese artists to America, especially to New York in the 1960s and 70s, but it appears that those artists had relatively little interaction with their compatriots in photography. Some Japanese photographers came to the United States. Daido Moriyama, who could not speak English, accompanied his friend Tadanori Yoko for Yoko's exhibition of posters at the Museum of Modern Art in 1971. Iko Narahara came for an extended stay in 1970 after spending 4 years in Europe. Ken OHara came through family connections and stayed. He now lives in Southern California. And Ichi Hosoi actively visited the United States and developed friendships with curators and photographers from the mid-60s. Ansel Adams invited him to teach at his Yosemite workshops in the 70s, for instance. The distinctive cultural tradition Japanese photographers have made is widely recognized now, but it took a while. The first institution to pay significant attention to modernist art in Japan was, not surprisingly, the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. In 1965, their show, The New Japanese Painting and Sculpture, opened actually at the San Francisco Museum of Art, our museum, then traveled to New York the following year. Although the photography department at MoMA was aware that something was happening in Japan at that time, it took almost a decade, until 1974, for the first real study of Japanese photography. New Japanese photography, organized by John Tchaikovsky with Shoji Yamagishi, opened at MoMA in 1974. And 5 years later, Yamagishi organized another show for the International Center for Photography in 1979, called Japan, a Self-Portrait. But by the end of that year, he had died. The activity that led to both these exhibitions is the subject of my talk tonight. Some years back, when I began to imagine a show on the work of Daido Moriyama, I asked Tchaikovsky how he became interested in Japanese photography and when. He said that when he came to the museum in 1962, photography was in a period of change. The popular photographic magazines, which had been the major venue for the medium, reflected this. They published not only the usual journalistic essays, but also some experimental, often decorative work. Like Steichen, when Tchaikovsky came to the museum in 1962, he wanted to show the work of Eugene Smith, which sounds surprising now, knowing what he did, but it was very current interest at that time. Tchaikovsky also made an exhibition called The Photo Essay in 1965, marking a change from the photography of an event, classical photojournalism, to the photographer's impression or reaction to what he saw. The popular magazines also published work from as well as about Japan. This spread by Eiko Hosoi appeared in a Life magazine issue around the time of the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. It is also quite clear that Tchaikovsky and his predecessor, Edward Steichen, had some significant help from Japanese photographers. And the earliest and perhaps most important one was Yasuhiro Ichi Moto, who knew and worked with both of them. Ichi Moto was born in San Francisco in 1921, though he was taken back to Japan as a child of 3. He returned to California to attend the Agriculture College at the University of California in Berkeley. His parents were landowners, just in time to be sent to the internment camp at Amachi in Colorado, where he stayed for the duration of the war. Despite the trauma of internment, he was grateful that at Amachi he learned photography. And when he was released, he went immediately to Chicago, where he studied with Harry Callahan at the famous School of Design there. Founded in 1938 by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy after his forced journey from the original Bauhaus in Germany, the ID taught Bauhaus principles, experimentalism, understanding of media, and a commitment to modern design in all areas of practice. In later years, when I knew him living in Japan, Ichi Moto would speak very fondly of Callahan and his time in Chicago, saying that Callahan was his great teacher. His friend and fellow student in Chicago, Marvin Newman, who made a film with him there, tells me Ichi Moto considered Chicago his second home. It was certainly a very productive place for him to make pictures. Ichi Moto returned to Tokyo in 1953 after his studies in Chicago, where he taught design and worked as an architectural photographer. Then he returned to Chicago for an extended stay, 1959 to 1961, before he left the United States permanently. At some point, Callahan introduced him to Steichen. Ichi Moto had a one-person show at the Art Institute in 1960, and the following year he was included in an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that Steichen organized. By then, he was living in Japan. In 1953, when Ichi Moto was back in Japan for the first time, Steichen asked him to help locate appropriate Japanese photographers to include in his exhibition, The Family of Man. This show was the culminating curatorial effort of Steichen's career. It was designed to publicize American-style democracy and caution against future Holocaust through a humanistic program of pictures in an elegant, modern exhibition design. It is well known that the show drew the largest attendance in the museum's history, and its catalog is still in print. When it opened in New York, it included over 500 pictures and represented work made in 68 countries, including 40 pictures by 38 Japanese photographers, acknowledging the important photojournalistic work in Japan of that period. Ichi Moto was represented exclusively with work from Chicago, and the style of his pictures was very different from that of the other Japanese photographers. So here you see one of his pictures made quite early in Chicago on the bottom left, and on the top left here, another picture. These pictures were actually also included in the show that I'm going to talk to you about a little bit later that was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. When he was appointed director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art after World War II, Edward Steichen developed a program that recognized styles or ideas rather than the contributions of single photographers. Steichen was a concerned liberal patriot, and Life magazine provided a generous number of photographers for the Family of Man. He also supported the work from the Magnum Agency, which espoused more left-leaning ideals by photographers who controlled the ways their pictures were used. Although not widely known, Magnum photographers were especially focused in Asia in general, and Japan in particular, in the 1950s. Cartier-Bresson spent much time in Indonesia as well as Japan. Robert Capa was also very active in Japan, and his brother Cornell also visited Japan at this time. The Magnum photographer who made the most extensive study of Japan was Werner Bischoff. Although not a member of Magnum, Eugene Smith also periodically visited Japan, though his most important work there would come in 1971 to 1973, when he documented the industrial mercury poisoning in Minamata. Magnum photographers also helped to establish early photography exhibitions in the new large department store gallery spaces in Tokyo. So there was a certain amount of cultural interchange among American, or generally Western photographers, and their Japanese colleagues during the 50s decade and into the early 60s. The Japanese photographers that interested Steichen included Hiroshi Hosoi, who was the only Japanese magnum photographer of this period, Ihei Kimura, Shizuo Yamamoto, and some others, and he included them in his show and in the catalog. So here you can see there's Cartier-Bresson shown with a picture from Indonesia, but also underneath a couple of Japanese photographers included in the family of man. Here they are. And then this work from Life magazine, a picture by Carl Meidens of Japanese farmers. In 1953, Steichen visited Japan to make a special version of the family of man for Japanese audiences. With Ichi Moto's help, he added the work of about 60 Japanese photographers to the exhibition, and he also selected the modernist architect Kenzo Tange to supervise the installation, modifying Paul Rudolph's original exhibition design. But this version of the show proved to be problematic. The original New York version of the family of man included a picture at the very end of an exploding atomic bomb in a darkened room, an implicit warning to visitors that mankind had the ability to do significant damage if the message of being a family went unheeded. Steichen realized that the show's ending needed to be rethought, and with Ichi Moto's assistance, decided to include work made by Yosuke Yamahata, a photographer who died from nuclear contamination after photographing in Nagasaki a day after the bombing. The Japanese authorities were uncomfortable with these pictures, and they were removed after the show opened, although the picture in the middle here is by Yamahata. It's been cut down, and it was included, in fact, in the original Family of Man exhibition. The Family of Man was not a success in Japan, and in fact, it probably stimulated the formation of the Japanese photographers group Vivo as an antithesis to the pro-American optimism it projected. Steichen also asked Ichi Moto to photograph the famous Katsura Palace for MoMA's Curator of Architecture and Design, Arthur Drexler. This is in the 50s too, 50s and 60s. The museum was then showing what Americans would call the minor arts of Japan, its pottery, its calligraphy. And at the same time, the family of man was on display, the Japanese exhibition house opened, a traditional Japanese wooden house constructed on the museum's grounds, which visitors were encouraged to explore. Ichi Moto's extensive study of Katsura, the famous palace outside of Tokyo, evolved over time. But the first book was called Katsura, Tradition and Creation in Japanese Architecture. It was published jointly by Yale and Zokeisha, with text by Walter Gropius and Kenzo Tange in 1960. So it was very consciously a group effort. Ichi Moto found his training at the Institute of Design especially useful in this project. He continued to photograph both Katsura and other Japanese monuments well into old age, and liked to describe the form and space in the ancient palace as, he said, very modern. Although he was making some very distinctive work in Japan, work that was important to his Japanese contemporaries, Ichi Moto was not happy there. Therefore, in 1959, with the help of a grant from Minolta, he returned to Chicago. He said of that time, quote, "The photography world in Japan was not open, and I was regarded as a person on the American side, a so-called outsider," unquote. He stayed 3 years, but felt forced to return to Japan by the vicious McCarthyism of the United States. Before he left, Ichi Moto probably helped Grace Mayer and Steichen with another show at the Modern called Abstraction in Photography that included a large donation of Japanese photographs from the Japanese newspaper, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, in 1960. Not a very interesting show, but you can see Callahan is included among the Japanese here. So now I'm going to show you some of Ichi Moto's work. Ichi Moto was one of 3 photographers included in the 1961 presentation of Steichen's series entitled Diogenes with a Camera, so-called, as the press release claims, quote, to indicate photography's contribution to the search for truth. The 2 other photographers were Bill Brandt, with selections from his series Perspectives of Nudes, and Lucien Clerc, who was represented by post-war pictures of decay. Ichi Moto is described in the PR as, quote, an American of Japanese heritage, unquote, who worked in Japan as well as being trained in the United States, and who was represented in a previous MoMA exhibition in 1953 called Always the Young Strangers, which I think is very interesting, signifying that he was also a stranger. His significant publication record and exhibition history were acknowledged. The show represented a highlight of Ichi Moto's relationship with the modern and the beginning of his friendship with Grace Mayer, who was first Steichen's assistant and then Tchaikovsky's assistant, and who began a correspondence with him in Japan. There's another picture that was included in that show. In November 1962, Mayer wrote Ichi Moto to tell him that Steichen was now director of photography emeritus and that Tchaikovsky had arrived to lead the department. She also tells him that they have seen Eugene Smith, who returned recently from Japan, quote, with some very fine work, and we hope to give him a retrospective exhibition in the spring, unquote, planned for 1963. A story with Smith's pictures of the manufacturing giant Hitachi was published in Life magazine that year, but the Smith retrospective never occurred, since he required total control of the selection and display. And in any case, by that time, Tchaikovsky's interests were beginning to change. In May 1964, Ichi Moto was again in touch with Mayer, happy to know that he would be represented in the opening exhibition of the Edward Steichen Photography Center with a picture from the book he did in Chicago, published in 1958. As the Department of Photography was transitioning from the old order of Steichen's leadership to the new under John Tchaikovsky, the museum generally showed serious interest in what was happening in Japan. Japanese was shown and discussed in the spring of 1964, and the International Council sponsored a show called Japanese Art Today. I mentioned earlier the exhibition New Japanese Painting and Sculpture that opened in 1965 in San Francisco before traveling to New York. All this focus was in part tied to the Tokyo Summer Olympics of that year, the reason Life magazine ran a special issue on Hosoi and the picture of Mishima. With these stimuli, and certainly with the Rockefeller commitment to the study of Japan, Tchaikovsky pursued his interest in Japanese photography. In April 1966, Mayer wrote to Ichi Moto saying, quote, "The fact that you are bringing work by young Japanese photographers is of great and very special interest to us, as John Tchaikovsky, who, as you know, is now the director of the department, has been advancing the idea of an exhibition on this very subject for some time now." And Ichi Moto writes back to her, It is such a wonderful thing to know that your museum is planning to have an exhibition for Japanese photography. I will be delighted very much if I can help your plan. However, there seems to have been some confusion about procedure, as Ichi Moto wrote Meyer in August asking the department to be in touch with Mr. Masao Koyasu, the editor of Asahi Camera, who he says has, quote, kindly consented to collect and send various photographs and other materials, unquote. This was not good news for Tchaikovsky, who sensed a potential complication and wrote back clarifying that the show had not yet been scheduled and continued, quote, under the circumstances, it would be unfortunate if great enthusiasm and expectations were aroused at this point, which might lead to later disappointment. It seems as though the idea was put on hold for at least a year, but in July 1967, Tchaikovsky, not Meyer, wrote Ichi Moto directly, thanking him for sending the dummy of Narahara's book, Where Time Has Stopped. Ichi Moto sent examples of work by other photographers, but Tchaikovsky was especially interested in Narahara's dummy. Okay, so here's the work that was seen in the Chicago work that was seen in the Museum of Modern Art. Let me show you what Ichi Moto was doing in Tokyo when he returned with his understanding of Institute of Design ideas. Here is some of his work on the Katsura Palace. That was very modernist and was very interesting to the architecture department there. And this, which is also part of the Katsura Palace project, the early project, was how he was represented in the show New Japanese Photography when it was finally selected. Then I'm going to show you this, which is when he returned to Japan, this kind of street photography that Ichi Moto adopted among other projects that he had here. And now finally, I will show you the final book, or the cover for the book, of Iko Narahara's Where Time Has Stopped, which is a very interesting but quite eccentric group of photographs. So Tchaikovsky was especially interested in Narahara's dummy. Quote to Ichi Moto, I found much of the work fascinating and think that some of the progressions and juxtapositions are most effective. Can you tell me more about Mr. Narahara and the book? When Narahara came to New York in 1970, Tchaikovsky told him that his book was the one most requested by other photographers. So you see another couple of pictures. In the fall 1967, Tchaikovsky again wrote Ichi Moto, asking his help in obtaining some examples of Narahara's work for the collection. Quote, whether this would be as part of a group show or as a small one-man exhibition, I have not decided as yet, he says. The correspondence seems to stop again for 3 years when Tchaikovsky again writes Ichi Moto, now with some more concrete ideas for a group show of Japanese photography. He says, quote, I envision the exhibition not as an exhaustive survey, but as one that will concentrate on the work of a relatively few photographers of exceptional significance in Japanese photography during the past 20 years. I suspect it is true in Japan, as it is here, that the popular magazines do not necessarily give an accurate sense of the most original and vital work being done. And I am, in effect, asking your suggestions as to the names of those photographers whose work I should see before determining the content of the exhibition, unquote. He also asked for help in locating where the photographers might be geographically, and he says he wants to visit museums and private collections of photography, which it did not exist, as he was to find out. Tchaikovsky finally made his trip to Tokyo in 1971 and stayed about 2 weeks. Besides his meetings with photographers, he visited the offices of Camera Mainichi to study the magazine's back issues and came to know its editor, the charismatic Shoji Yamagishi. Without specialized museums or private collections, the magazine became Tchaikovsky's reference library and Yamagishi his valued instructor, and he would later invite Yamagishi to collaborate on the show. Although they remained good friends after Tchaikovsky's departure, their correspondence is not voluminous. Yamagishi visited New York at least twice before the show opened, and other times sent his wife Coco. Since there was no tradition of fine printing for photography in Japan, Yamagishi helped arrange for the printing of most of the pictures. Tchaikovsky displayed them as he would his other shows. The pictures were framed and arranged with a modernist clarity. There were other Japanese photographers Tchaikovsky came to know in New York as he was organizing the show. As mentioned earlier, he was very interested in the dummy of Narahara's book, Where Time Has Stopped. Narahara was originally trained to be a lawyer, but after holding a week-long show that generated much attention while he was still in school, he turned to focus on photography. He was soon involved in a circle of like-minded young photographers, first to organize a series of exhibitions called The Eyes of 10, beginning in 1957, then in 1959 to form a casual photo agency, Vivo, a kind of Magnum-inspired photographic collective that focused attention on Japan. These photographers, which included Ichi Hosoi and Shomei Tohmatsu, would evolve personal photographic styles from their work in journalism and fashion, work that in some cases was highly eccentric. These exhibitions and the group were organized in part to articulate a Japanese voice in contradistinction to the more sentimental work they had seen in the family of man. The pictures in Narahara's book are intense, highly individualistic, made in Europe on an extended stay there, 1962 to 65. They are also distinctively Japanese. When he returned to Japan, he addressed the culture of his own country in his next book, Japanesque, which was published in 1970. That same year, he left Japan for the United States, where he lived in New York until 1974. Narahara is also remembered because he attended some of the workshops Diane Arbus taught. Because he felt he could not trust his English, Narahara brought a tape recorder to her classes at Westbeth in 1971 to capture her commentary on her work. After her suicide, Narahara gave the tape to her family, and the transcription provides much of the text in the Aperture monograph that accompanied her retrospective show in 1972. Narahara's pictures of the United States were published in his book, Where Time Has Vanished, in 1975, and he was represented in the MoMA show mainly with pictures of the United States. Ken OHara came to the United States in 1962 because his father worked for Fujifilm, where he was in charge of the New York offices. He had seen the Japanese version of The Family of Man in Tokyo. Living in Greenwich Village, OHara met the Japanese artists Yoko Ono and Yayoi Kusama, and the Americans Yvonne Rainer and Tricia Brown. He worked for Hiro, the Japanese fashion photographer who had a business relationship with Avedon, and through Avedon, he met Avedon's friends, including Diane Arbus, Marvin Israel, and Jacques-Henri Lartigue, who visited New York as Avedon was editing his book, Diary of a Century. OHara started to shoot pictures for his book, One, in 1969, finding his subjects in Washington Square Park and Central Park in much the same way that Arbus found them. They are all made with natural light and all at a normal distance from the subjects, later cropped closely to achieve the provocative relationships established in the book. The book was published in Japan the following year, 1970. Avedon admired One and told him to see Tchaikovsky. And when Tchaikovsky expressed an interest in including some examples in his exhibition, OHara explained that he saw the project not as a group of individual pictures, but as an entire book, a conceptual project, in other words. OHara left for a year of travel, and when he returned in 1970, Tchaikovsky encouraged him to apply for a Guggenheim grant, which he received. He was included in New Japanese Photography, where his work was represented in book form. However, Tchaikovsky was not interested in his next project, which was more explicitly conceptual. In 1988, he moved to California, where he still practices his conceptual work. Ichi Hosoi's work was also known to Tchaikovsky before he visited Japan. As a high school student, Hosoi became so interested in America and American things, he learned English with a proficiency rare among the Japanese of his generation. He saw and devoured Life magazines readily available at the American Cultural Center, and was awakened to photography when he saw an exhibition of Edward Weston's work there in 1953. His first show in 1956 was a photo essay heavily indebted to Life called An American Girl in Tokyo, which you see here. But quite soon afterwards, Hosoi's interests and style changed dramatically, becoming more personal, theatrical, and expressively Japanese. By 1959, when he saw Hijikata's dance inspired by the Mishima novel 1951 called Forbidden Colors, he found a subject that was to prove especially fruitful. Hijikata developed Buto, an expressionistic, mythic, and essentially Japanese dance that engrossed Hosoi. The following year, Hosoi met the writer Yukio Mishima, who commissioned Hosoi to photograph him. The portrait sessions stretched out 2 months, and Hosoi produced his most important and most known work called Barake, Killed by Roses, as a book published in 1962. Actually, Hosoi's assistant for this project was Daido Moriyama. Hosoi evolved a distinctively expressive and consciously Japanese style. He also proved to be an adept promoter. Because of his command of English, he began to travel to the United States in 1964. He was especially interested in California, where he met Ansel Adams. He would teach in the Yosemite workshops in 1972 to 74. This is an example. And later actually bought property in Northern California. In 1969, the Smithsonian Institution bought his series, Man and Woman, made with Hijikata and his dancers, and showed it. The following year, he had an exhibition at the Focus Gallery, and in 1972, he showed at Light Gallery in New York. Perhaps most important, however, in 1968, he visited the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York, where he met Nathan Lyons, who had produced a show and cataloged called Contemporary Photography Toward a Social Landscape in 1966. This book introduced the work of Bruce Davidson, Lee Friedlander, Gary Winogrand, Danny Lyon, and Dwayne Michaels to the Japanese, where it was received with enthusiasm and became instantly influential. Kampora photography, which followed, took its name as well as its formal inspiration from the work found in the small catalog, When Hosoi visited the Eastman House 2 years later, he arranged a show of masters of photography, mainly American photography, to travel to Japan. In 1971, W. Eugene Smith came to Japan with his Japanese-American wife for a stay of 3 years to photograph in Minamata, a fishing village in western Japan, which suffered from industrial mercury poisoning. The work he produced there, powerful and dark, was effective and emotional journalism, but by this time, his work was not as important to the museum as it had been earlier. In 1967, Tchaikovsky had organized New Documents, a show that included the work of Gary Winogrand, Diane Arbus, and Lee Friedlander, presenting a more personal documentary style that would determine the direction of the museum's photography department in the years to come. When Tchaikovsky came to Japan in 1971, both he and the Japanese photographers he visited had moved beyond the kind of work that Steichen had promoted and that Tchaikovsky himself had studied when he first arrived at the museum. It must have taken only a few days into his visit for Tchaikovsky to realize Ichi Moto's limitations as a guide to what was happening in current Japanese photography. Tchaikovsky, with Yamagishi's help, focused attention on the newer developments in Japan, relegating Ichi Moto's contribution to that of the preceding generation, along with Domon Ken, an older photographer. With Yamagishi's assistance, the two photographers that dominated the exhibition when it opened in 1974 were Shomei Tohmatsu, born in 1930, and Daido Moriyama, a generation younger. Tohmatsu was a dynamic figure, and he's on the cover of the catalog. Very much a loner, tremendously intelligent and driven. He was motivated by a passionate desire to wrest Japan from its compromising position with the United States and to assert a new modern Japanese culture and self-regard. He was one of the founders of Vivo, the Japanese photo agency styled on Magnum, which promoted an individualistic, even aggressive modernist photography. As a counterweight to the show that Hosoi had organized from the Eastman House collection, a show of mainly American photo masterworks, Tohmatsu was the driving force between a massive exhibition of the same year, 1968, called 100 Years of Japanese Photography, which opened at the Seibu department store. It was the first exhibition of its kind, a vivid, dramatic, and often violent visual history of Japanese photography from its beginnings to 1968. It also featured the pictures of Hiroshima by Yamahata, the photographer whose pictures were chosen to accompany The Family of Man in its Japanese version, but these were much more direct and meaningful. Tohmatsu's own work was criticized, especially by the old guard, as impressionistic with no discernible narrative. One critic derided the work as, quote, a poem composed in photography. But in the MoMA catalog, Yamagishi wrote, quote, it is apparent that Tohmatsu's photographs are not an objective record of what happened. And in the same catalog, Tchaikovsky called Tohmatsu, quote, the pivotal figure whose work has defined the iconography, style, and method against which the younger photographers measured their own identities, and goes on to say, Tohmatsu's gradual rejection of the concept of journalistic illustration parallels a similar change in spirit among many talented photographers around the world during the same period. So these are probably the more journalistic pictures he made that were some of them were included in the show. They were all included in the show. This was not. This we actually found when we did our Tohmatsu show. Tohmatsu's younger contemporary, Daido Moriyama, made pictures that evoked a spirit of ennui, very different from Tohmatsu's aggressive, assertive work. Moriyama was a friend of the writer and photographer Takuma Nakahira, who originally worked with Tohmatsu on the 100 Years of Japanese Photography exhibit, but separated himself from the older man. These younger photographers published Provoke, a magazine that lasted only 3 issues, but which accurately reflected the emotional unease of those years in Japan. Some of the photographers whose work appeared in Provoke were influenced by what they saw in the catalog from the Eastman House, pictures by Winogrand, Friedlander, and others. Moriyama's work had evolved from an acute fascination with the ambiguous presence of Americans in Japan, especially around the many American bases, to a more despairing, even nihilistic representation of Japan in the early 70s. The pictures that appeared in New Japanese Photography, which I'm showing you now, including this amazing picture made on an American base, Air Force base, and this one made from another American base, are from his earlier books. They present a culture of the American presence as fascinating and vital. Tchaikovsky says of Moriyama, "The suggestion of the nihilistic that exists in Tohmatsu's work has been made boldly and effectively explicit by Moriyama. Indeed, what is intuition in Tohmatsu becomes an almost mystical obscurantism in Moriyama." Tchaikovsky's partner Yamagishi described the exhibition concept a little differently. Rather than presenting a large overview, he saw the show as, quote, was organized as a series of one-man shows, which identified the central concerns of each of the 15 photographers. He also adds gracefully, quote, "Many of the essentials of modern photography were learned in the post-war period from Yasuhiro Ichi Moto, who brought them from the United States when he returned from Japan to Japan. Although it might have been possible to learn the philosophy and techniques of modern photography from someone else, I would like to make it clear that without Ichi Moto, we would never have achieved today's photography." Yamagishi left Camera Mainichi in 1978, frustrated by the demands of the newspaper's corporate administration and its focus on the amateur market. He continued to arrange shows of American photographers in Japan and to represent Japanese photography in the United States. In 1979, he opened a show he prepared with Cornell Kappa at the International Center for Photography called Japan, a Self-Portrait. It included 19 photographers, including some from the MoMA show. Iko Narahara's picture of a Zen monk was on the catalog cover. There were some important additions, including the work of Araki, for instance, and Ishiushi, the only woman to be included in either of these exhibitions, and also the photographic work made by the conceptual artist Yamazaki. Japan, a Self-Portrait continued the approach he acknowledged in the MoMA show. He said it was not a large overview, but like the photo editor he was, it comprised a series of one-person shows. With his death later that year, the dialogue between contemporary Japanese photography and what was happening in America effectively ceased. Americans would only later recover an interest in Japanese photography. Thank you. Now I realize that was a very specialized show. I hope it wasn't completely unintelligible, however.
Well, thank you so much. I think, are you okay to take a few
Yes, of
questions
course,
from
absolutely.
the crowd? Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
This,
So you spoke quite a lot about American photographers' work going to Japan and American photographers photographing in Japan. But would you speak a little bit about the influence of the Japanese photographers' work on American photographers who saw that work?
I don't know of any, actually. I think it's very hard for Americans to come. Very hard for Americans to come. They didn't generally know the language.
About like that ICP show.
The ICP show was Japanese photographers presented to an American audience. But I don't think there was much travel the other way from America to Japan. Unfortunately, I mean, going to Japan for an American it's a very different culture. The signs are all written in Japanese, and it takes a lot of understanding to get around. It's not a Western culture. How it influenced. I can't think of any real examples. Alas, I wish I could.
I'm often asked why now, why there's so much interest in Japanese photography. And I wanted to ask your thoughts on contemporary scholarship and also academics, because I think now there are a number of Western, American, European people who are studying about Japanese photography and Japanese art history for, say, the last 15 years, and they're now moving into museum positions, and
Why
I'd like
now?
to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. Japanese photography has suddenly become commercially viable, where it was completely not before. And it's become not only viable, it's become incredibly popular. And at the same time, there's been a not only interest in the original photographs, which, as I explained, was not part of the culture, but of the magazines and the books that were so rare because they were so limited. Nobody was interested in them except other photographers or other photography in people who were interested in this. I think, the work is so great. The reason I started working on it was because it just seemed obvious. And it's true, we had taken that show, New Japanese Photography, many years ago. My predecessor, Van Daren Koch, had in fact bought some Japanese photographs. But it was just, and we were this little museum on the west coast of the United States. Nobody was paying much attention to anything. And the Japanese were just like so enchanted that an American would be interested at all in what they had done, and were so hospitable and so moved, really, that somebody from the United States would take interest in them. So I'm thrilled that there exists this current interest. I think it's great. I also think that, it must have been, I remember talking to Tchaikovsky about his trip, and he said, I couldn't figure out how to get around. I couldn't figure out how to find the addresses, which is still very complicated. But, now we have, we have systems. We put on our MapQuest, and it makes it much easier. But it was harder then. And it's, I think, easier now. I think it's easier. Say that again, I'm sorry.
There's so many more, you personally have contributed to this immensely. There are more exhibitions, there's more exhibitions, I think there's a lot of scholarship available in English, here, in the West. Yes, and I think, do you get more requests from graduate students or young curators to learn about Japanese photography?
The big problem is still the language, reading it. It's not a European language. It's not a language that we're easily familiar with. I will give you a very specific example. We, as you know, the museum's closed, and we are reopening. And one of the shows we are reopening. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the shows we are reopening with is a show dedicated to recent gifts and purchases of Japanese photography, which will be a big show because we've had a lot of wonderful gifts. But one of the donors is a Japanese man who doesn't speak much English. So I need to find somebody who is a scholar, who can read Japanese, and who knows the photography world. That, even in San Francisco, was really hard. I found a person, but it was really hard. Yes?
Do you think that the photographers are pretty much known at this point, or is there potential that all kinds of people with this more focus will come out of the woodwork and will realize that there's all kinds of photographers, shows of work, or do you think it was kind of a set group that's understood?
You mean historically or contemporarily?
Contemporarily, but more people from the historical time surface. Vivian Mayer, or however you pronounce her name.
Oh.
Or is it pretty much known that these are the people?
You know, there's a very, very lively culture for photography in Japan. And if you're attentive to all the magazines and all that you get through emails, you kind of know, I think. There's a lot of young photography. There's a lot, just like here, there's a lot of stuff that's not interesting. So the big issue is really finding what's good. That's always the problem. It's interesting. It's an interesting challenge. Yes.
So you gave us this wonderful kind of early overview till 1979, the ICP show. But then you said with Yamagishi's death, for the exchange stopped.
Yeah.
And am I correct to understand that that exchange got picked up again at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art with the shows that you curated?
Well,
how did it get picked up again? And when would you say it got picked up again?
Well, let's see. That's an interesting question. Well, as I was saying, it seemed natural for us to do this. We're a museum that doesn't have extraordinary resources, and Japan was close, and they had this tradition, and it seemed like an obvious place to go to make shows. But there were other, the Boston Museum has this long tradition of Japanese collecting because of its history, from the 19th century. I think there are little areas of Japanese attention in the United States. It's not just with us. But I think the recent interest is kind of remarkable. And I think it's wonderful. Yes?
What was your first trip to Japan?
What was my first trip to Japan? When? Good question. It was about 1992 or something like that. Yeah, we did open the Moriyama show in 1999, I think. We had to wait until we closed the first building, and then, yeah, it took us a while. It took me a while. It was hard. It was hard to figure out how to do it. And I worked with Yamagishi's widow. That's how I did it. because I went to John and I said, what do I do? And he said, call up Coco. So that's what I did. So it was a kind of interesting continuation of that. Yes.
When you were talking about Hosoi,
Yeah.
you mentioned something about consciously Japanese style.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What is consciously Japanese?
Well, he was, he was trying to shed his Life magazine interests and his American roots. And, Life magazine, I assume, was the editor the founder of Life. Luce was very interested in Japan, especially after the war. He was born in Asia. His father and mother were both evangelistic people, yes, missionaries, in fact. So he was always interested in Japan. There was a lot of, I didn't go through all the Japanese articles in Life magazine, but there were plenty of them. And I think that with these two people, Mishima and Hijikata, who were real collaborators with him, they were very consciously evolving a style that was what they would call essentially Japanese, discarding, literally taking off your clothes and discarding the affect of Western culture. And there was actually a very interesting film that Hosoi made with, I think it was Hijikata, called Navel and A-Bomb, which is all about his dance, and which is very stark, and which his work is totally related to. So yeah, it talks of being in the countryside, not in the city, being with Hijikata. There's other projects that Hosoi did. One with Hijikata where he took on the aspect of an ancient sort of mystical Japanese folk demon in the countryside and made those amazing pictures. So I think there was and I haven't been able to reach Hosoi before this talk and talk to him about this, but I think at least in the work it's utterly clear that it was very conscious.
Any other questions? I have one.
Oh.
Yes, there is. Thank you for kind of drawing out this history that I think, in the show upstairs, we sort of refer obliquely to earlier traditions before 1968, and the show kind of plunks you into 1968 and beyond. And now with this, is this working? Now with this sort of recent interest in the market, in other exhibitions of Japanese photography from this period, from the 60s and 70s, and also upcoming contemporary Japanese photography shows. Where would you say would be a really good area to create an exhibition of Japanese photography? Where do you see any holes or lacunae, or what do you think would be the next way forward? You don't have to, tell us all your secrets. But
I would say there's two areas, one of which has been begun. There's a show at the Getty on women photographers, and Ishiuchi is an extremely important figure. And there's a lot of very interesting young women photographers, the Eiko Shiga, for instance, which seems to be sort of paid attention to now. But the other area that I'm interested in also is Fukushima and the devastation there, the atomic, devastation of the countryside, the tsunami that was a part of it, and there's this show that's coming here. That's an interesting show. I think it's going to take a while for the really good work of this moment to surface. There's a lot of activity. Maybe in 10 years, It'll be considered like, you know, the bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki that Tohmatsu photographed. It took him a while to get there too. So I think a real serious later examination of that will be really interesting.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.